Please, don't walk away until the song is over. The words were almost swallowed by the roar of evening traffic. Yet they reached Nathan Brooks with a force no boardroom presentation, stock report, or billion-dollar negotiation ever had. He stopped in the middle of Michigan Avenue, one polished shoe frozen above the sidewalk as the city rushed around him without slowing down. Taxi horns echoed between the glass towers, buses hissed to a halt, and crowds flowed past like an endless river of hurried strangers. But somewhere beneath the metallic heartbeat of downtown Chicago rose a voice so clear, so gentle, and so heartbreakingly sincere that time itself seemed to hesitate. Nathan turned toward the sound. Across the street, beneath the faded awning of an old bookstore that had long since closed its doors, stood a little black girl no older than 8. Her oversized denim jacket had clearly belonged to someone much taller. The sleeves rolled back several times to reveal tiny hands wrapped around a weathered acoustic guitar with chipped edges and worn strings. Her sneakers had once been white, but now carried the gray dust of countless city blocks, and a knitted blue beanie covered neatly braided hair except for a few loose curls dancing in the cool autumn breeze. Beside her rested an old backpack patched with different pieces of fabric, a small battery-powered recorder, and a cardboard cup containing only a few dollar bills and scattered coins that she never once looked at. She wasn't singing to the people passing by. She wasn't performing for applause. She sang as though only one person in the entire world was listening. Nathan found himself crossing the street without realizing it. He had canceled meetings with governors, delayed flights for Fortune 500 executives, and walked away from interviews with national television hosts. Yet somehow a child with a tired guitar had quietly rearranged his evening. The closer he came, the more he noticed the lyrics. They weren't polished or famous. They sounded homemade, almost like a lullaby someone had written while holding on to hope with both hands. Every note carried warmth instead of sadness, dignity instead of desperation. People tossed bills into the cup as they hurried past, assuming she was another homeless child trying to survive another cold night in the city. She never paused to thank them. She never reached for the money. She simply kept singing with her eyes gently fixed on the little recorder beside her feet, as though the tiny blinking red light mattered far more than every dollar landing in the cup. Nathan stood silently at the edge of the gathering crowd. For the first time in years, nobody recognized him. Nobody asked for photographs, business advice, or donations. Everyone's attention belonged entirely to the little girl and the impossible calm surrounding her voice. Then, just before the final chorus, she smiled softly at the recorder and whispered words that made Nathan's heartbeat stumble. "I hope Grandma remembers me tomorrow." The music continued, but everything else inside him fell completely silent. The final note faded into the cool evening air, lingering just long enough for the city to forget its own noise. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the spell broke beneath a wave of polite applause, the clinking of coins, and hurried footsteps returning to their ordinary rhythm. The little girl lowered her guitar carefully, almost tenderly, as though it were far more valuable than it appeared. She smiled at no one in particular, reached for the small recorder resting beside her backpack, and pressed the stop button with both hands. Before she even glanced toward the paper cup filled with bills and loose change, she replayed the recording through a pair of inexpensive headphones with peeling foam. She listened with complete concentration, nodding quietly whenever her own voice remained clear above the traffic. Nathan watched every movement without speaking. He had expected gratitude for the money people had offered. Instead, she acted as though the cash did not exist. A businessman in an expensive overcoat stepped forward and dropped a crisp $100 bill into the cup. "Beautiful voice," he said kindly before disappearing into the crowd. The girl looked up with genuine appreciation, not for the money, but for the compliment. "Thank you, sir," she answered softly. She waited until he was gone before lifting the bill, smoothing its folded corners, and placing it inside a separate envelope tucked deep into her backpack. Every other dollar followed the same careful routine. Nothing went into her pocket. Nothing was counted. Everything disappeared into the same envelope marked only with neat handwriting that Nathan could not quite read from where he stood. A nearby coffee vendor leaned across his cart and called out, "Hey, Amara, you keeping enough for yourself tonight?" She smiled warmly and shook her head. "I already have what I need." The vendor sighed with familiar resignation. as though they had repeated this conversation dozens of times. One of these days you are going to let somebody help you. Amara simply laughed, zipped her backpack closed, and slung the worn straps across her shoulders. Nathan finally stepped closer. That was beautiful, he said. She looked up, surprised but unafraid. Thank you. You have an incredible gift. She shrugged modestly. Grandma says everybody has one. Mine just happens to make noise. Nathan smiled despite himself. May I buy you some dinner? She hesitated only long enough to be polite. That is very kind, but I cannot stay long. Then at least let me buy you something warm to drink. She considered the offer before giving a small nod. They walked together to the coffee cart, where Nathan ordered hot chocolate while Amara quietly requested only a cup of hot water. The vendor handed it to her without charging a cent. She thanked him as though he had given her something priceless. Nathan noticed she slipped a tea bag from the side pocket of her backpack before stirring the steaming water with slow, careful movements. You really should have the hot chocolate, Nathan said gently. It is colder than it looks. She smiled again, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and quiet certainty. The hot chocolate costs more. This is enough. Nathan studied her face. There was no embarrassment, no resentment, only peaceful conviction. As they stood beneath the glowing streetlights, she looked down at the recorder in her hands and whispered almost to herself. I hope this one is clear enough. Nathan glanced toward the little device. Do you record every song? She held it close against her jacket and nodded. Every single one. Because tomorrow. Her voice grew almost weightless. Tomorrow she might not remember who I am, but she always remembers my singing. Amara carefully slipped the recorder back into its faded cloth pouch before tightening the drawstring with practiced hands. Nathan noticed how naturally she protected the tiny device, almost the way another child might carry a treasured toy or a family photograph. They continued walking beneath rows of glowing streetlights while the cool October breeze carried the scent of roasted nuts from a nearby food cart. Office workers hurried toward commuter trains, couples laughed outside crowded restaurants, and bright windows reflected across polished skyscrapers. Yet Amara seemed untouched by the city's endless rush. She walked with quiet purpose, never looking into storefront displays or slowing near expensive shops. Every few steps, she gently tapped the side of her backpack, making certain the recorder was still safely inside. Nathan finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind ever since the song ended. Would you mind telling me why those recordings matter so much? Amara looked up at him with thoughtful eyes before answering. Because memories disappear faster than voices. Nathan frowned slightly. What do you mean? She reached into her backpack again and removed a small plastic case no larger than a paperback novel. Inside, dozens of tiny memory cards rested in neat rows, each labeled with careful handwriting. Some carried dates. Others carried simple titles like Morning Song, Rain Song, Happy Tuesday, Grandma's Favorite, and Good Night. Nathan stared in disbelief. Did you organize all of these? She nodded proudly. There are 117 so far. He blinked. 117? I make a new one every day. Nathan gently picked up one of the cards after she offered it to him. The label read simply, Do not forget today. The words settled heavily inside his chest. Does your grandmother listen to every single one? Amara smiled, but this time her smile carried both hope and sadness. Sometimes she listens to one song all day because she thinks it is the first time she has ever heard it. Nathan remained silent. Some mornings she remembers my name before breakfast. Amara continued quietly. Some mornings she calls me by my mother's name. Sometimes she thinks I am still a baby. Other days she asks where her students are because she believes she has to teach piano that afternoon. She looked down at the memory card resting in Nathan's hand. But whenever she hears me sing, she smiles. Even if she forgets everything 5 minutes later, she smiles every single time. The evening suddenly felt much colder. Nathan had spent years studying market trends, predicting industries, and solving impossible business problems. Yet he could think of nothing to say to an 8-year-old girl who measured time not by birthdays or school semesters, but by how many songs remained before another memory faded away. Amara carefully returned the card to its place and closed the plastic case with gentle precision. I always make 2 copies, she explained. One stays with Grandma, and one stays with me in case something happens. Nathan glanced toward the recorder again. That is why you check every recording before you leave. She nodded. If the traffic is too loud or if I make a mistake, I sing it again. She deserves the best version. Nathan felt something shift quietly inside him. It was not pity. It was admiration. Standing beneath the glow of a passing elevated train, he realized that the little girl everyone assumed was singing for spare change had actually been building a library of love, one song at a time, hoping each recording might help one precious memory survive until tomorrow. The plastic case disappeared safely into Amara's backpack, and for a few moments neither of them spoke. The city continued moving around them, but the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt meaningful. Nathan glanced toward the nearest train station where commuters disappeared behind sliding glass doors, then back at the little girl standing beside him. "Would it be all right if I met your grandmother?" he asked gently. Amara studied his face for several seconds, almost as though she had learned not to trust quickly but had not forgotten how to recognize kindness. "You really want to meet her?" she asked. "I do." She looked toward the darkening sky before giving a small nod. "Then we should go now? She usually gets sleepy after 8. They began walking north, leaving the bright shopping district behind. The sidewalks gradually became quieter, and the towering office buildings gave way to older brick apartments, neighborhood grocery stores, and family-owned laundromats with warm yellow lights glowing through steamed windows. Nathan expected her to lead him toward a shelter or a temporary camp, but instead she turned onto a peaceful residential street lined with maple trees whose autumn leaves covered the sidewalks like a patchwork quilt. She stopped in front of a weathered recreational vehicle parked legally beside the curb. The old vehicle had faded white paint, carefully repaired windows, and flower pots resting on a small folding table outside. Someone had swept the surrounding sidewalk until it looked cleaner than many front porches nearby. Wind chimes made from old silver spoons gently rang above the entrance whenever the breeze passed through. Nathan looked around with quiet surprise. Nothing about the place suggested hopelessness. Everything reflected care. Amara unlocked the door with a small key hanging from a blue ribbon around her neck. Before stepping inside, she removed her sneakers and neatly placed them beside the entrance mat. Nathan followed her example without being asked. The inside of the vehicle smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old books. Every inch of the compact space had been organized with remarkable attention. Folded blankets rested on one shelf. Canned food was stacked neatly inside wooden crates. A tiny vase held fresh daisies that someone had picked from somewhere nearby. Against the far wall stood an upright electric keyboard with several keys yellowed by age. Framed photographs covered the narrow shelves above it. In nearly every picture, the same smiling woman sat beside children of different ages gathered around a piano. "Grandma," Amara called softly. "I am home." A gentle voice answered from the back. "Is that my little songbird?" Amara's face immediately brightened. "Yes, Grandma." An elderly woman slowly stepped into the small living area, wearing a lavender sweater and soft gray slippers. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and although her movements were careful, her eyes carried remarkable warmth. She smiled at Amara first, then noticed Nathan standing respectfully near the doorway. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed her face. "Do we have company?" she asked. Amara walked over and took her hand. "His name is Nathan. He listened to my whole song." The elderly woman smiled as though that single sentence explained everything. She reached out to shake Nathan's hand with quiet grace. "Anyone who listens until the last note is always welcome in our home." Nathan gently accepted her hand, but as he looked into her kind eyes, he noticed something that made his heart quietly ache. Resting on the small table beside her favorite chair sat a stack of compact discs, each one carefully labeled in a child's handwriting, waiting patiently to help tomorrow remember what today might forget. The elderly woman welcomed Nathan with the same gentle smile she might have offered an old friend, then motioned toward a small wooden chair beside the keyboard. "Please sit," she said warmly. "I always believe conversations sound better after music." Nathan thanked her and quietly took the seat, noticing how carefully every object inside the recreational vehicle had been preserved. The keyboard was old but spotless. The framed photographs had been dusted recently. Even the stack of music books showed repaired bindings instead of replacements, as though every page carried memories too valuable to discard. Amara disappeared into the tiny kitchenette and returned with 3 steaming mugs of herbal tea. She handed the first to her grandmother, the second to Nathan, and kept the last one for herself. "We always drink tea after singing," she explained with a smile. "Grandma says it lets the music stay a little longer." The older woman laughed softly. "I might have said that." She looked toward Nathan with amused honesty. "Some days I cannot remember what I had for breakfast, but somehow my granddaughter remembers everything I have ever taught her." Nathan smiled. "She remembers because it matters." The woman looked thoughtfully at Amara before nodding. "She has always listened with her heart." For several peaceful minutes they talked about simple things. The changing leaves outside, the chilly weather arriving earlier than expected, the neighborhood librarian who saved old books from being thrown away. Nathan noticed how naturally Amara cared for her grandmother without drawing attention to it. She quietly adjusted the blanket across her lap when the evening became cooler. She refilled her tea before the cup became empty. She gently reminded her to take a small evening vitamin, never sounding impatient or rehearsed. Everything came from love instead of obligation. Nathan had attended charity galas where generosity was celebrated beneath crystal chandeliers and television cameras. Yet this tiny home revealed a quieter kind of kindness that asked for no audience. His eyes wandered toward the photographs above the keyboard. One picture in particular caught his attention. It showed the elderly woman many years younger, sitting at a polished grand piano surrounded by nearly 20 smiling children. Every child held a music folder, and behind them hung a banner reading Community Youth Spring Recital. "Were you a music teacher?" Nathan asked. The woman tilted her head thoughtfully. Before she could answer, uncertainty crossed her face. She looked toward Amara with gentle confusion. "Was I?" Amara reached over and squeezed her hand. "Yes, Grandma. You taught piano for many years." The woman's eyes brightened. "That sounds right." She smiled again as though rediscovering a treasured memory. "I always believed every child deserved music, even if their family could not afford lessons." Nathan looked back at the photograph. "Those students must remember you." The woman gave a peaceful shrug. "I hope they remember the music more than they remember me." Amara quietly stood, walked to a nearby shelf, and carefully selected one of the compact discs. She placed it into a small player beside the keyboard. Moments later, her own voice filled the little home, singing the same gentle melody Nathan had heard downtown. The elderly woman's face immediately relaxed. Her shoulders softened. She closed her eyes and smiled with complete recognition, softly humming along to every note. Nathan watched in silence, overwhelmed by the quiet miracle unfolding before him. The woman who had struggled to remember her own profession remembered every lyric her granddaughter had recorded. As the final note faded through the tiny speakers, she reached for Amara's hand and whispered with absolute certainty, "There is my beautiful girl." Amara smiled back with glistening eyes, not because the memory would last forever, but because for one precious moment, love had found its way home once again. Later that evening, after sharing one more cup of tea and thanking both Amara and her grandmother for their kindness, Nathan stepped back onto the quiet residential street with a feeling he had not experienced in years. The city lights still shimmered against the skyline, but they no longer seemed as bright as the warmth he had just left behind inside that small recreational vehicle. Before climbing into the black sedan that had finally located him through several unanswered phone calls, he looked back once more. Through the tiny window, he could see Amara carefully helping her grandmother arrange the stack of compact discs beside the keyboard, preparing tomorrow's songs before tonight had even ended. The image stayed with him all the way home. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, where hundreds of lights reflected across the dark water like scattered stars. Normally, Nathan ended every evening reviewing financial reports or preparing for the next day's meetings. Instead, he found himself sitting alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, unable to open a single document. His thoughts kept returning to the handwritten labels on those memory cards, to the flower pots outside the recreational vehicle, and to the peaceful smile that appeared on the elderly woman's face whenever Amara's voice filled the room. Before going to bed, Nathan opened his laptop and typed a simple search into the company's historical newspaper archive that his foundation subscribed to. He entered only 3 words: Chicago piano teacher. Thousands of results appeared. He narrowed the search by adding community recital, youth music, and neighborhood lessons. Several articles surfaced from more than 20 years earlier. Most were small community features buried deep inside local newspapers, stories that had never reached national headlines. One photograph immediately caught his attention. It showed the same smiling woman from the framed pictures inside the recreational vehicle, standing beside an upright piano while children of every background gathered around her with bright expressions. The headline read, "Local teacher opens free music program for every child." Nathan clicked the article. It described how Eleanor Johnson had spent decades offering free piano lessons to families who could not afford formal instruction. Parents praised her patience. Former students described her as the person who first convinced them that talent belonged to everyone, not only those with money. Donations had always been accepted but never required. Nathan continued reading article after article. Every story repeated the same pattern. She quietly paid for sheet music herself. She repaired broken instruments instead of replacing them. She organized neighborhood recitals so children could experience the confidence of performing before an audience. Yet nowhere did he find awards, public recognition, or personal wealth. She had given thousands of hours to others without expecting anything in return. Nathan leaned back slowly. Earlier that evening she had struggled to remember her own career, but an entire generation had once known her name. He whispered it softly to himself. Eleanor Johnson. Something about it felt strangely familiar. He could not explain why. He searched deeper into archived recital programs, faded newsletters, and scanned photographs until one worn image stopped him completely. Standing near the edge of a crowded children's recital was a young boy with neatly combed blonde hair, sitting nervously beside an old piano while a gentle teacher rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Nathan moved closer to the screen. His breath caught. The little boy looked unmistakably like himself at 8 years old. The caption beneath the photograph had faded with age, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. Special thanks to Miss Eleanor for welcoming every child who walked through her door. Nathan remained frozen before the glowing computer screen long after midnight. The faded photograph refused to let him look away. He leaned closer until every blurred detail became unmistakable. The little blonde boy sitting nervously beside the piano wore a navy sweater with one missing button. Nathan remembered that sweater. His mother had stitched it together after buying it from a neighborhood thrift store because it was all they could afford during one difficult winter. A memory he had not visited in decades slowly returned. He remembered refusing to enter the music room because the other children carried polished instrument cases while he arrived empty-handed. He remembered wanting to leave before anyone noticed. Then a kind teacher had knelt beside him, smiled warmly, and whispered, "Music does not care how much money your family has. It only asks whether your heart is willing to listen." Nathan closed his eyes. He could hear those words as clearly as if they had been spoken only yesterday. His breathing slowed. He searched through another box of digital archives until he found an old community newsletter featuring interviews with former parents. One sentence immediately caught his attention. A mother had written, "Miss Eleanor quietly paid for my son's lessons after I lost my job, but she never allowed him to know because she wanted him to keep his confidence." Nathan felt his chest tighten. His own mother had lost her factory job when he was 8 years old. She had cried in the kitchen one evening, believing he was asleep. The following week his piano lessons somehow continued without interruption. Until this moment, he had always believed a local scholarship had covered the cost. His hands trembled as he reached toward a small cedar box resting on a bookshelf across the room. Inside were a handful of treasured keepsakes he had carried through every move despite rarely opening them. Beneath old photographs and childhood drawings lay a folded thank you card written in his mother's familiar handwriting. The paper had yellowed with time. Nathan carefully unfolded it. Across the top she had written, "Dear Miss Eleanor, I will never forget what you have done for my son." He read the letter once, then again, hardly believing the words in front of him. His mother had explained that she could not afford lessons after losing her income. Yet Miss Eleanor insisted Nathan continue attending every week without paying a single dollar. She wrote that one day, if life became kinder, she hoped her son would grow into the generous man Miss Eleanor already believed he could become. Nathan slowly lowered the letter onto the desk. For years he had accepted awards celebrating his leadership, signed charitable donations, and spoken publicly about opportunity, never realizing that his own opportunity had quietly begun inside a modest neighborhood music room because one teacher refused to let poverty decide a child's future. He looked once more at the photograph beside his computer screen. The smiling teacher in the picture was the same gentle woman who now depended upon her granddaughter's songs to remember each new day. Tears gathered in Nathan's eyes, not from sorrow but from overwhelming gratitude. He finally understood why Eleanor Johnson's name had felt so familiar the moment he had read it. She had not simply taught music. She had helped compose the opening chapter of his entire life. And somehow neither she nor the remarkable little girl caring for her had ever asked for anything in return. Nathan did not sleep that night. As the first light of dawn spread across Lake Michigan, he was already sitting at the long conference table inside the headquarters of Brooks Capital, surrounded by executives who expected another discussion about acquisitions and quarterly forecasts. Instead, he quietly placed the faded newspaper photograph and his mother's handwritten letter in the center of the table. The room fell silent. Everything this company has become, he began calmly, started because one music teacher believed a frightened little boy deserved a chance, even when his family could not pay for it. No one interrupted. They had rarely seen Nathan speak with such personal conviction. He explained how Eleanor Johnson had spent decades opening doors for children whose dreams might otherwise have been forgotten. He described the little recreational vehicle, the carefully repaired keyboard, the neatly labeled recordings, and the remarkable granddaughter who spent every evening creating new songs so love could outlast fading memories. When he finished, one executive quietly asked, "What would you like us to do?" Nathan looked toward the skyline beyond the conference room windows before answering. "We are not going to rescue anyone. They have already shown extraordinary strength. We are simply going to honor a promise that should have been kept years ago." Within hours, his foundation contacted community music organizations, former students, neighborhood schools, and local historians. They discovered hundreds of stories that sounded remarkably alike. Adults from every profession remembered Miss Eleanor as the teacher who never turned away a child because of money. Doctors, firefighters, engineers, teachers, musicians, and small business owners all shared memories of borrowed instruments, free lessons, encouraging letters, and patient smiles. Some admitted they would never have discovered their confidence without her quiet belief in them. Others confessed they had often wondered what had happened to the woman who had changed their childhood. Nathan read every message personally. Each one strengthened the decision already forming in his heart. 3 days later, he returned to the quiet residential street, not with television cameras or reporters, but carrying only a small folder and a familiar smile. Amara opened the recreational vehicle door and looked genuinely surprised to see him again. "You came back," she said happily. "I said I would," Nathan replied. Eleanor welcomed him with the same kindness she had shown before, although she asked his name once again. Nathan introduced himself with gentle patience, grateful simply to be there. After sharing tea together, he placed the folder on the small table beside the keyboard. "Miss Eleanor," he said softly, "I would like to ask your permission to create something in your honor." She looked at him with curious eyes. "In my honor?" He nodded. "A community music foundation where every child can learn, no matter what their family can afford. It will carry your name because your kindness has already shaped more lives than you ever realized." Eleanor smiled politely, uncertain whether she fully understood. Before she could answer, Amara quietly reached for her grandmother's hand. The elderly woman looked down at her granddaughter, then back at Nathan with gentle sincerity. "If it helps children find music," she said softly, "then it was never mine to keep. Music always belonged to everyone." The announcement spread through Chicago faster than anyone expected, but not because of advertising or celebrity endorsements. It spread from one grateful heart to another. Former students called former classmates. Families searched through dusty photo albums. Forgotten recital programs were pulled from attic boxes. Handwritten notes tucked inside old piano books suddenly became priceless reminders of a woman who had quietly changed hundreds of lives without ever asking to be remembered. On a crisp Saturday afternoon several weeks later, the doors of the newly restored Eleanor Johnson Community Music Center opened for the first time. Children filled the bright rehearsal rooms with laughter, nervous excitement, and the uneven sounds of beginners discovering their first notes. Parents gathered along the walls with grateful smiles, many of them remembering how impossible music lessons had once seemed to afford. Nathan stood near the entrance, not as the center of attention, but as another guest celebrating the woman who had inspired it all. His name appeared nowhere on the building. Above the entrance, only one simple inscription welcomed every visitor. Every child deserves to be heard. Eleanor arrived with Amara shortly before the dedication ceremony. She looked around the beautiful building with quiet curiosity, occasionally asking where they were, then smiling again each time. Amara gently reminded her. Nathan walked over and welcomed them both. He did not speak about business success or charitable giving. Instead, he handed Eleanor a small scrapbook filled with letters collected from former students across the country. One by one, Amara read them aloud. A surgeon thanked her for believing in a shy little boy who had doubted himself. A school teacher wrote that she now offered free tutoring because she wanted to pass kindness forward exactly as Miss Eleanor once had. A firefighter remembered borrowing a trumpet that she secretly repaired herself before returning it with a smile. Each letter ended with nearly the same words. "Thank you for seeing me before I believed in myself." Eleanor listened quietly, sometimes confused by the details, sometimes smiling without fully understanding, yet always touched by the warmth in every voice. Then the children gathered around the grand piano placed at the center of the room. Nathan looked toward Amara. "Would you begin?" he asked gently. She nodded, took a slow breath, and started singing the same gentle melody that had first stopped him on a busy Chicago sidewalk. One by one, the children joined her until the room became filled with dozens of young voices rising together in perfect sincerity. Eleanor closed her eyes. Her fingers moved softly across the piano keys, almost by instinct, accompanying the song without hesitation. When the final note faded, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Amara. For a long, quiet moment, nothing else seemed to exist. Then her face brightened with unmistakable recognition. She reached out, gently held her granddaughter's hands, and said with complete certainty, "There is my beautiful girl. Thank you for singing me home." Tears filled Nathan's eyes as he watched the moment unfold. He finally understood that wealth could build beautiful buildings, but only kindness could fill them with meaning. The greatest investment he had ever made had not been measured in dollars, but in gratitude returned to the woman who had once believed that every child deserved a chance. And it had all begun because one little girl never sang for money. She only hoped that someone she loved would remember her voice.